Good afternoon. As he said, my name is Melissa Provencher, and I am a project manager with the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission. Just out of curiosity, how many people know where Berkshire County, Massachusetts is? Okay, a little bit more than I thought, maybe. So we're the westernmost county in Massachusetts. We're actually closer to Albany than we are probably Springfield even. And we are one of several regional planning agencies throughout Massachusetts. We were founded in 1966, and we work with the 30 towns in 2 cities within the county boundaries, providing a range of planning services from transportation to economic development to local planning, community development block grants, our brownfields program, just to name a few. We have, since the beginning of the NPDES Phase 2 program, had 3 of our communities impacted by that. So that dates back to the 1999 regulations, the 2000 census, and then the 2003 regulation. So our largest city, our City of Pittsfield, has been regulated from the beginning, as well as the towns of Dalton and Lanesborough. This regulation, as I think probably most of you know, is based on the census urbanized area. So as that area is essentially, in our case, based on Pittsfield, and as that has grown, we have now encompassed the town of Adams, and the town of Cheshire will be newly regulated beginning in July of this year. And this just shows a kind of a little bit of an example, because it's not the entire regulated area, but it shows Pittsfield and gives an idea of how that starts to kind of branch out. The urbanized area does branch out into the towns of Richmond, Lenox, and Hinsdale as well. We haven't focused on those communities much because the urbanized area is so small. It actually does just barely cross the line over into the city of North Adams as well. But when I say just barely, I think the population within the regulated area of North Adams is 8. So, I mean, just barely. So the towns of Richmond, Lenox, and Hinsdale were affected by the original permit, but their area is so small and their population is so sparse that they've been able to get waivers, and they are currently in the process of working on that for the new regulations. So the problem, though, that our communities are faced with, as I'm sure probably all of you know, there's limited resource, increasing obligations, declining state aid. We hear out in the Berkshires, at least, that the school budgets are a significant portion of municipal budgets, as much as 70%, and those continue to grow where the taxes and the kind of the revenues are declining. Also, the increasing healthcare cost with the staffing has been something that's been a real challenge for a lot of our communities to address. So what we did was we thought, how can we take a regional approach with the NPDES regulation? And we were very fortunate to get a grant from Department of Environmental Protection as a 604B Water Quality Assessment grant. So that's coming from 604B of the Clean Water Act. And our project goals were to assist our communities with an effective strategy, to provide some outside expertise to them, to benefit from shared knowledge, expertise, and efficiency. And a lot of our project focused on both how to comply, but also how to plan and how to fund your compliance. So with this regional approach, we first formed a working group. We have representatives from sort of the budget side as well as the implementation side, so town managers and administrators and DPW supers. It's a challenging group to work with because everybody's got a limited amount of time, and so we didn't focus a lot on working group meetings that were, everybody coming together and meeting, but we did hold a couple. And we worked behind the scenes to evaluate funding mechanisms as well as the existing town practices, and Rebecca will get into that a bit more. But we developed a questionnaire to send to them to gather information about what it is that they're already doing so that we could create a baseline. And then we had to look at the cost of compliance. Are there activities that are already being undertaken that help to move you towards compliance? And so you're already taking them, you already have a budget for them, but then what needs to be added on to that? And then we looked at options for regionalization. How can you take that, this is what you need to do to comply with the new regulation on top of what you're already doing, and this is how much it's going to cost, and can we start to sort of shave that down by gaining efficiencies and also by sharing costs? So as I said, we had representatives from the implementation side as well as from the budget side, and we focused a lot on the cost of the program and then getting feedback. And I will, since CEI was the one that did the bulk of the work in terms of developing the questionnaire, I will turn it over to Rebecca here.
Okay, so the first thing we did is we developed a questionnaire. We wanted to get some input from each of the communities. We realized they were all different sizes, they all have different issues. And in that, we wanted to collect a lot of information about not only what they were doing with their existing programs, if they had one, but also their infrastructure, because we needed that information to help us prepare cost estimates of what this is going to cost them to comply with it. So as Nick showed earlier with the MS forecaster, there were specific items in there, such as number of catch basins and number of outfalls that we used to help estimate those things. So what came out of that, what we were able to find is, all the communities said they had some level of mapping. Weren't real specific as to what level or what format that was in, but they all had something, and most of them had at least some of their outfalls mapped, and the ones that were already regulated had all of their outfalls mapped. We found that all of them, I think it was pretty much everyone, already did street sweeping and catch basin cleaning, and a lot of them did that annually already. So a lot of them were already meeting that component, and we didn't include that in the cost estimates, only unless they had to increase sweeping because they had an impaired water or something like that to twice a year for those areas. Most of them already performed some form of public education, so they had programs in place, whether it was their website or they did mailings or just posted things at their town halls. All of them did have something in place in terms of some type of education. Regulations, most of them had regulations. We didn't, under this project, we weren't able to go in any great detail and evaluate, to what level these were already developed. But we tried to get specific in terms of what they had for regulation and what it covered pertaining to the permit, and they all said they did have something in place. We also looked at stormwater pollution prevention plans. Some of the communities already had some of those in place. This is one of the requirements under the new permit that wasn't previously carried. Certain municipal facilities have to have these individual plans, which are separate from the stormwater management program, and some of these communities already had developed some of these for some of their facilities, while others had not. We also asked some questions about what they would be interested in doing a joint effort on. Where do they need help? Where would it be helpful to have BRPC come in and try to give them things that everybody could use? And all of them were interested in some type of cost sharing, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So after we got the results of the questionnaire, we basically used the MS forecaster that Nick talked about to come up with some budget estimates. In some cases, a lot of the communities, I think Pittsfield had the most information. They were able to actually give us actual counts of things. A lot of the other answers were, well, we're not quite sure how many, so we had to use a lot of default values in terms of number of outfalls, number of catchments, catch basins, where that information wasn't provided. So as Nick had mentioned, the cost tool that EPA had developed was broken into 3 different size communities, and we were able to kind of fit them into one of those sizes and apply the defaults that were used in those budget estimates where we didn't have information. The costs that I'm about to show you, the estimates that we did come up with, are based on additional costs. So if they already had a street sweeping and catch basin program in place, that was not included in here. That's why you might see the numbers might be a little bit lower than what we were looking at for Yarmouth earlier, which did include that in their final budget, the catch basin cleaning and the street sweeping. These communities are also, some of them are very small Pittsfield is larger at the 40,000 plus, but the rest of the communities are fairly small. So we developed costs. We wanted each community to have an understanding of what this program could cost them on an individual basis. If they were to go at it alone, what could they expect to spend? This just shows we have ranges. If anybody has spent any time looking at the EPA spreadsheet tools, they are providing ranges for costs because there are a lot of assumptions, as I had mentioned earlier. So these ranges cover a variation of those types of assumptions. You know, there could be a different level of endangered species review, which is a smaller item, but level of public education, the cost range is pretty wide on that in terms of what somebody wants to implement. And then the key junction structures, you know, it can range from 25 to 75% of your catch basins being key junction structures that require further investigation. So that's where some of the ranges come in. We did break out the TMDL and impaired waters as a separate cost. All of these communities do have impaired waters, which will add to their baseline costs. So we provided both of those for them to see. We also met with, we had a couple meetings, as Melissa had mentioned, and we did go out and meet with some of the communities individually to try to get some better information from them. And, you know, this program is new to 2 of the communities, so it was kind of an education process as well, really to inform them of what is expected out of them. So I think they learned a lot out of the process of what's coming down the pipe for them. So then the next piece was to outline some cost savings opportunities, and this is just a preliminary list. We had education and outreach. I'll talk about each of these a little bit more. Written plan templates, mostly associated around kind of developing templates that each community could use. They'd still have to put their own work effort into it, but it at least gives them a baseline of something that they can use for the format and kind of fill in the blanks. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those. So for the public education, you know, Mass DEP, they're going to talk after this about some of the public education materials that they're developing. We know there are education materials out there. The idea here was to come up with something that there was a unified message for Berkshire. A lot of them have the same TMDL waters, so if we could kind of incorporate that message into some of them as well, that would be a piece of it. Materials that they could all take and use, and it would just, as I said, just be a uniform message that they could send out. The other piece of that is they could also have BRPC assist them with the distribution of those materials, so they could develop them as well as help with that. For plans and procedures, we're looking at various templates. The first was the stormwater management plan, because there really is no template available for that now. You know, the permit does outline what needs to be included in it, but the thought was to develop something that, again, give them a format and a layout, make it a living document, set it up so that all of the updatable pieces are in the appendix, for example. They could easily pull something out and throw something else in there without having to go back to their text and make any changes. So it's really the format and giving them some organization to help them with that, and then having written language where they really could fill in a lot of the pieces. The IDDE plan, there actually is a template that came out this past year in 2016 from the Central Massachusetts Regional Stormwater Coalition. So they have a lot of, they've been developing materials for the last couple of years to help with permit compliance. So that is something that is available as a tool that people can use. They've also developed a stormwater pollution prevention plan template that communities can use as well for those individual facilities that I had talked about where you might need a separate plan. Some of the other plans, O&M procedures. For that one, we were looking, I talked a little bit about how we pulled together the plans for Yarmouth with the 26 SOPs. And there are some other materials out there. For example, the CMRSC also has some materials on some SOPs. It's not the full everything that could be covered, but there are things out there. So we were thinking having that and in a format again where it can be identified what specifically goes to what types of facilities, similar to what was done for Yarmouth. Pre-construction peer review templates, there are some checklists and things that need to be done. You have to have written procedures under the permit, so kind of putting those into a format that people can just take and then you know, easily revise for themselves. Construction site inspections, having checklists and forms and templates. Those we have incorporated into standard operating procedures. And the Central Mass Stormwater Coalition has done some of those as well. As-built and long-term O&M. The permit does require, with the regulations, facilities are required to have some type of enforcement mechanism. You know, you are responsible if you have private drainage that comes into your MS4, you're responsible for ensuring that the quality in your system is good. So there, you know, when a new development comes into play and they have their own BMPs, you want to have some type of mechanism in place to ensure that they're doing the maintenance on those. So some of that would be coming up with the language, and we get a lot of questions about that, is what's the best way to do that? So it would be coming up with the different options that communities could have so they can pick and choose in the language to incorporate into their regulations. Draft bylaws and ordinances, that's really just to incorporate the new changes to the regulations, how they need to be updated, the language for that, and then there are some specific components for impaired waters that also have to be incorporated into the regulation. So it was coming up with some of that language that could be used as a template as well. The IDDE training, providing, you know, it could be, that could be a number of different formats. It could be having somebody actually go out with the various communities and showing them how to use field kits in the field versus just a video. It could be a video presentation, really what would work best for the communities, but the idea is to train them so that they can implement their field programs themselves. And then the equipment sharing. So we also looked at some regional labor and equipment sharing, and what came into play there. These were a little harder to cost, but shared interns. One of the first slides that Melissa went over showed the urbanized areas for two of the communities. One was Cheshire and one was Pittsfield. Pittsfield has a very large urbanized area. Cheshire has a very small urbanized area. It really ran up one of the streams and included a lot of state roads. They had very little of their own. So some communities, you know, some of the really small communities maybe can't afford to have a full-time intern, and they don't need a full-time intern. So the idea is maybe BRPC could hire an intern, and then you know, the communities could share that intern to help them with field mapping or whatever services that they needed. Some other things we're looking at purchasing and sharing of equipment. So the sampling kits that Nick talked about, you could maybe get some discounts if you bought them in bulk. Some GPS equipment for doing their mapping. They could share that as well. Those are some more expensive items. So those are things that are being looked at. The other thing we looked at was joint procurement of services, whether it's street sweeping or catch basin cleaning, hire an outside contractor. One of the things that came up in particular in one of the communities was that they had some proprietary systems that they had to have cleaned out occasionally. And they said, boy, it's really expensive to get somebody out here from the Boston area to come clean these. We have to pay a surcharge for them. Basically, they're paying for a day to come clean 2 structures. So they said that would be something we would love to share, you know, figure out what everybody else has for BMPs, and maybe we could join efforts on that, and they come out and do all of the 5 communities at the same time. So those are some of the things that kind of came up with that. So the cost savings, we looked at, well, I guess before we get into that, the TMDLs, forgot about that. The TMDLs, they all do have, this table here shows what each of the communities have impairments for. So they were all listed for the Long Island Sound TMDL, which is for nitrogen. And what we later found out as we were digging into this, Adam said, why does this apply to me? I'm not in that watershed. So we did a little digging, and sure enough, they're not. So it was just something that was missed in the comments. It should have been something that was commented on when the draft permit came out. So something that they now have to put into their NOI when they do it to say, we're not within this, we shouldn't, you know, we don't have to do anything for that. And we also found that Cheshire, they have a tiny bit of their town that's in it, but it's not in the urbanized area. So again, those things may not apply to them. But in terms of TMDL, some of the cost savings that we were thinking about there is a lot of the communities have to develop what's called a nutrient source identification report. So we were thinking some type of template format to help them determine how to prioritize their areas and develop that so that they can go out and do the implementation that they need. And then the regulatory language I already covered. That would be covered as part of the regulatory updates. So the cost savings, this graphic really just shows the top here would be the total cost if they did it individually. And for simplification, we just took the averages of those ranges that I showed you before. So we added the baseline with the TMDL cost, and then we averaged the low and the high, just for simplification purposes. So up top here is what it would cost them on their own. This orange brownish color represents the potential savings if they combined efforts to try to develop some of these tools and materials together. And I just had a quick note up there. The average savings was about $75,000 to $130,000 per community over the 5-year permit term. And that was based on an initial investment of about $70,000 combined if they all pitched in for these different things. And as I said, some of the templates that we had included kind of came out during the process. So there's probably some additional or lower saving or more savings. So conclusion, there are some substantial cost savings possible. If they, as I just mentioned, spent a combined $70,000 or so, they could save $75,000 to $130,000, depending on the community. Many items can be templated. There are things that would be beneficial to all, and if they were developed for all of them, everybody would get a benefit out of that. And then there are some others that we had mentioned that could be done almost entirely by BRPC, such as the education components, and where they just get some outside assistance for those. And Melissa's going to talk about our next steps with this project before we finish up here.
So after CEI put together all of this great information, we went out and met with each of the communities individually, and based on prior discussions and then these individual meetings, it was confirmed that all of the communities are interested in some kind of regional effort, and wherever they can get any efficiencies and wherever they can save any costs. But the question is how do we make that happen? In terms of funding, there are very limited grant opportunities. The 604B program and 319 program, both through Mass DEP, and both originally through EPA from the Clean Water Act, have some significant limitations on how they can be used for NPDES funding, and they're also competitive programs. There is an efficiency and regionalization program that's only been out for 2 rounds so far. We'll get into it in a little bit, but we did apply to do exactly this work under that program, and we were not awarded funding for that. Another potential funding source is through the Community Compact. One of our towns just recently entered into a compact with the state, and they have been able to secure funding for a couple of the items that they put in their compact for some economic development planning and for their stormwater management planning. So they were able to secure $15,000 to augment what they can spend at the local level, but at this point in time, it's unclear whether this is something other communities can take advantage of. Some of them may have already entered into a compact with other items as their priorities. Others may not have done that yet, but there's no guarantee that that funding is still going to be available. A stormwater utility is another tool that's been looked at as a potential mechanism for getting some funding to do this work. Most of our communities are simply just not ready. It requires a significant amount of education, outreach, and support to the community because these things would have to pass either through city council or in most cases at an annual town meeting. And any additional tax that's levied is a real challenge. So then it comes down to funding it through their municipal budgets. And we discussed earlier that they have declining revenues, declining state aid, increasing school budgets, increasing healthcare costs. So in order to do this through their municipal budgets, they need to do as much as they can to look at cost sharing, efficiencies, and balance. And I think another thing that's also worth pointing out is that it's very difficult for the communities to do a couple of the things that they have to do here. It's difficult for them to look at this in its entirety as a 5-year plan because, as I said, most of our communities are doing everything that they need to do through an annual town budget, and they need it to be passed there. So they really can look at essentially 1 year at a time, and they also never know what might come up in the next year. So this just outlines quickly some of the things that we had applied for with regionalization grant. It was not awarded. However, it does develop a scope that the communities could potentially follow, doing exactly what I had just mentioned, using their own municipal budgets to look for where they can save costs and gain efficiencies. The other part is that it takes a level of community buy-in in order to do this, and the logistics need to be worked out. I mentioned each budget needs to be prepared as an individual annual budget. It needs to be approved at annual town meeting. The other question is, how can they share costs when they don't know necessarily how many communities are participating and where those costs are going to be saved?